Hi there. Welcome to Mushroom Hour. Today on Mushroom Hour, we are blessed by the presence of Mycomaterial Specialist Ashley Granter and Biofashion Designer Aurelie Fontan, founders of Osmose Studios. Osmose Studios is a multidisciplinary design studio dedicated to exploring how society should draw inspiration and processes from Mother Nature. Working with Mycelium as well as natural dyes and fabrics, they aim to bring forward beautiful design that doesn't cost the planet and actually fosters the regeneration of lost ecosystems. Now, returning to the Mushroom Hour after 2 years, Ashley, it's an honor to have you on the show, and Aurelie, it is fantastic to meet you.
It's an honor to be back on. Can't wait.
Thank you for having us.
Well, and for anyone that wants to go back in the archives, I believe it was episode 11 for Natura Design Studios that we had Ashley on before, if you want to hear more of that backstory. But as the new guest joining us and the other half of this dynamic duo, Aurelie, if you wouldn't mind, give us a quick overview of your background. Maybe how you fell in love with nature, how you got into working in this field of textiles and design.
Sure, yeah. So I have a very similar background to Ashley on how we found our way to biodesign. I did fashion training in Paris and also the UK, and I finished my master's degree at the Royal College of Art, and I created my own specialism called symbiotic design. Basically, I was also frustrated, like Ashley, not finding the right materials to work with when I was doing my bachelor, and I decided to specialize in biodesign. So I have self-taught experience, and I started working in biolabs, finding resources. So very, very similar, just experimenting on my own and growing textiles from bacteria and yeasts.
That's fascinating, and I love symbiotic design. How is that not a major everywhere? So great self-designed course of academic study there. And Ashley, give us that quick update of kind of how you've evolved since our last talk. Now, obviously, the company name has shifted, but just tell us a little bit how your practice has evolved and kind of what's happened in these 2 years.
Yeah, God, it's been a strange 2 years, especially with COVID. I've changed a lot in terms of the way that I'm working. I've started to do a lot of interior design projects. And when things were kicking off with Natura, at the same time, I actually met Aurelie, and we started to blend our separate professions together, which is why we've become Osmose Studios, which is kind of a multidisciplinary studio practice where we're looking at fashion and homeware, working with Mycelium, but not exclusively, but looking at how sustainability and sustainable materials can play a core and integral part of a business. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a sacrifice to be sustainable. It could be the best thing about it. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of restaurant projects, things like that, eyewear shops and things, and really just kind of seeing how we can project it out into the public in a way that is acceptable, because we have a lot of fungal phobic people out there where they don't necessarily want to touch it just because it's made from mushrooms. So how we translate that into a public setting has been kind of our main goal.
Yeah, well, what I was struck by in reading about your company is obviously Mycelium is still in there. You know, Mycelium is still tying everything together. It's a main part of kind of what you guys are doing, but you kind of have an expansive view of biomaterials and what are regenerative materials. I mean, even things like hemp and cotton, things that I know, but when you think about it more, like, yes, this is a biomaterial. So talk about that a little bit. When we talk biomaterials, obviously Mycelium is sexy. We love hearing about Mycelium furniture and all that. But tell us what the field of biomaterials kind of has transformed into for Osmose, and what areas you guys are focusing on. I know you just gave us the overview, but just drill down a little bit into kind of what this biomaterials field looks like for your practice.
I think what's interesting, at least from my point of view, is that we're not necessarily diving into this next gen high tech kind of venture, because we do have a part of our studio that makes mycelium leather. But obviously, as you know, the industry is quite varied. There's people going into really high tech stuff, working with bacteria, enzymes, and kind of genetic modification, obviously, and synthetic biology. That's really interesting. Obviously, we're not scientists. So what's interesting to us is maybe how to approach the low tech end of the spectrum. How can we not like regress to the past before synthetics happen, but almost see how we can work with nature in a way that's less, let's say, techy, and more harnessing the natural aspects of ecosystems and work with that kind of symbiotic attitude.
Yeah, we kind of basically want to make it as accessible for people as possible. We don't want to build these technologies that require a lot of costly machinery, a lot of know-how. We're wanting to kind of almost regress it to its more basic level so that we can have a better access globally rather than having it in one company that only knows how to work with it. So that's kind of our core value, because I think with that, we actually create the potential for more change rather than having it kind of really kept under lock and key. So yeah, and fungi has always been the heart of my passion anyway. So we're always going to stay with mycelium, but yeah, we're definitely invoking how we can also use other materials, because it's not just mycelium that's going to solve things. It'll be a mix of things. Mycelium has its benefits, but it still has its weak spots too. So it's, you know, how we blend all of those together and create design that doesn't have any kind of setbacks per se. So it's more just integrated naturally into things rather than having to be really forced through a mold.
Well, I really resonate with that ethos. When you invoked synthetic biology, I was like, ugh, my hackles get raised a little bit, because I'm not totally in love with re-engineering biology, but I do love that idea of understanding biology and being able to work with organisms better, whether that's as a material or however we symbiose with them in our lives, is to learn these organisms more fully, the materials they create, including things like cotton and hemp. And, you know, when we talk about some of these more, I would want to say, quote unquote, traditional materials, what are you guys doing to work with them in new ways? Maybe this is a process thing, maybe this is a treatment thing, because I'm also fascinated by this idea as folks like yourself explore novel kind of regenerative processes. Maybe that trickles out to start retrofitting industries. And maybe that's something you guys do, is consult with manufacturers who use these materials. So talk about that. What are you guys doing different with those materials that we kind of know and love to make them more regenerative?
I think maybe one thing we could talk about is the fact that we always, as humans, try to reinvent nature because we think we can do it better. But nature does a lot of things really well, which is what is regenerative design is essentially. It's really learning from it. A lot of people say co-creating with nature or collaborating with nature. It's really kind of going from the like nature-centric rather than human-centric. So not applying technology to nature, but trying to get the technology that's embedded in nature from the start. So a lot of stuff that we do is we look at, if we're working with an organism or a plant, we look at how it works already in its ecosystem. So what does it do? And is there anything that it does that we can bring into our designs? So does it create pigment? Does it create enzymes to decompose things? That's the basic kind of building block of the practice. So we like harnessing these things. And the second part, and Ashley can develop on that as well, is that we look at the abundance of what we get from nature as well. Is that an endangered species? Is that a common species? Is it invasive? All these kind of aspects are really important to understand. We talked about hemp. The hemp industry, for example, in the UK is not very developed because we don't have the facilities to treat hemp as a fiber and make textiles with it. But ideally, that would be a great solution. So we need people to do more research in that kind of thing to kind of phase out, destructive practices like cotton and things like that that are not super sustainable on that scale.
Yeah. And I think ironically as well, we're going back to a lot of the technologies that we had 100 years ago, for example. So Aurelie was saying about the UK and the fabric industry that we had. We used to have a booming industry in the UK about 40, 60 years ago. And now we basically have a lot of people who used to work in the industry, but no equipment in the UK because it's just been fizzled out. It's been all kind of sent overseas, or we've phased it out for like synthetics. So really a lot of it is just looking back at how we used to do it and being like, well, if it isn't broken, don't fix it kind of thing. And it's same with fungi, because there's a lot of things that we look at where it's like, wow, we didn't know that it did this. It's like, yes, we did about 2,000 years ago. It was already out there, and we're coming back to it thinking, well, actually, there is a lot more that we had already discovered that we can rediscover again and bring forwards a bit more. like with hemp and stuff like that, it's not a new concept, it really isn't. But in the industry, trying to change that practice, that is a hard and new concept, because we've gone so far down the path of having an industry that relies heavily on plastics, on really industrial energy intensive processes, because it was okay before in terms of the cost to the manufacturer or the cost to the climate wasn't really recognized. But now there's a lot of different pressures on it, and how do we bring it back to that side of things? So it's a really, really big question, and it's not going to take just as it takes a huge amount of people to start making that change forwards. It's definitely a collective effort, but we do love going to companies and trying to like foster that a little bit more, or at least get that seed in the brain of like, there is another way of doing this, and it's not going to cost you, it's actually going to make things better. So yeah.
Well, some huge themes there, including, in our first interview, Ashley, so much of your practice was informed by observation. So I love how Aurelie said, we observe these organisms, and that's kind of where the learning starts. And then I also love the idea of the ancient future, and not necessarily that we have to go 2,000 years back, but that idea of looking to the past as a ripe source for the future. In some of my free time, I've been doing a lot of reading, and there were so many cultures that were obsessed with antiquity. And like, what have we forgotten? And so much of our culture has been informed, like, what's the next new amazing thing that we have to figure out? And it's like, well, maybe there are things we have forgotten that we need to rediscover. And, I invoked cotton, but just to clarify, what fabrics are you guys working with? Because on your site, obviously everyone should look up Osmose Studio, go look at all the products, but on your site, the fashion that we see on there that my wife loves, what are the fabrics that you guys are focused in on? Is it hemp or, just what are those fabrics?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So obviously, because we've tried to embed more sustainability in our designs, you can't do it all. Obviously, you can't be a fabric manufacturer and have a completely transparent supply chain, because that's a whole life of work in itself. So what we try to do is to almost... yeah, we try to support hemp as a fiber. So at the moment, how hemp is used in the fashion industry is as a blend, because it's really hard to use it on its own. It's quite a coarse fiber, so to make something quite luxury, quite soft to wear. So it's blended with cotton. In that case, you can use recycled cotton, GOTS certified cotton. There's lots of options. You can use silk and piece silk blended with hemp as well. Depends if you are a vegan. And it's actually thinking that sustainability doesn't have to be perfect. I think that's an idea that we need to start talking about more as well, because when people look at businesses, they expect them to do everything perfectly. It's a lot of money and it's a lot of investment. Even to become a B Corp, for example, it's very complicated. It's a lot of work. So we're trying to do things the best way we can, where we can. And the focus that we use in terms of innovation, at the moment we work with natural dyes. So we're trying to reshore UK grown natural dyes, so we can have a more kind of shorter supply chain where you have your fabric, you dye it in-house, you sell it, people know exactly where the color comes from, and it's not from synthetic sources. So that's the most important part, is to understand where your stuff comes from. Yeah. And for designers as well, we can't like keep hiding behind a rock and just thinking, okay, like this is like a secret atelier making everything and you don't know where it comes from.
Yeah, transparency and honesty, I think, is going to be the core things that we need to start relying on as industry individuals, as companies and stuff like that. I think we need to start, really holding that as a core value, because it informs the customer in terms of what they're purchasing. And there's a lot of almost greenwashing, I guess, nowadays, which is widespread. It's almost like fake news at this point, and it's really not clear to consumers what they're buying or where it's coming from or what's really gone into it. Because hemp, for example, very good, but if you do a certain process like water retting, that's actually quite an environmentally harmful process. But there are other ways of doing it. You just don't know where some suppliers get them from and how they do it. Cheaper methods are always going to prevail in business sense, but the transparency doesn't usually follow through. So it's definitely like being really careful about the choices we're making, especially as a company, and being as honest as we can of like, this is how we're trying to make a difference. There are a few bits we're falling short on, and we want to improve on these, but we're being transparent about everything. So I think that's the core thing.
Well, and I know there are people that are really deep into this issue. It's a relatively new issue for me. I have t-shirts on my website and someone was like, is that fast fashion? Are those sustainable? And I'm, oh, I don't know. That's a great point. But when you talk about, having to do the best job that you can, I think that's so important to remember as we're in a process of transition, right? I know a lot of people expect us to just boop, pop up the new system. Here's the entirely new way of doing things, already fully formed. We don't need to take any advantage of, the economies of scale or anything from this old system. But the fact is, there's going to be a blend as you work more and more toward that new system. So I really appreciate you guys fleshing that out. And man, the amount of learning, I mean, it's going to take folks like yourself who have the courage to go out and try to do this to learn, what is water retting? What are these processes? What are the questions to ask as we try to transition to kind of a more sustainable, I love using the word regenerative instead of sustainable, but a more regenerative way of doing things. What are those questions to ask? Who do you start working with? So yeah, transparency, but also with that understanding that, not everyone is going to achieve perfection right out of the gate of what kind of the dream future might be. And then, with the clothing, what's some of that design inspiration? That's something else I want to cover. I think I'm seeing bioforms in there, but what's some of that design inspiration for making the clothes?
That I think on the website it's a capsule collection I was doing after I graduated, and I thought what would be interesting is to look at materials and make almost like going back to a sense of minimalism, but focusing on a very key kind of fabrics, because obviously fashion designers want to use everything and anything, have lots of colors, just make it really crazy and super beautiful. And I used to do that because I used to work in couture, and in couture you don't really worry about the sustainability, or at least the houses in Paris don't, because it's very low quantities. You're almost making custom pieces for clients and they have specific requirements. I think personally that they should be more interested in that because they lead the pack and everyone is looking up to them. But when you're trying to almost push the boundaries, you're not really worrying necessarily about the material that you're using. My approach was different. So in 2018, I grew an entire couture dress out of kombucha.
Under your bed.
Under my bed in my bedroom,
What?
in my uni bedroom. So I was growing kombucha, like biofilm. If anyone has done biomaterials before, they probably know that. It's a kind of, I don't want to say it's a leather because it doesn't have the same properties, but it's almost like a translucent kind of film. It's a mix between leather and plastic. And it's very, I would say a lot of people use it now in experimentation because it's very accessible. You don't need a lab. And I made this dress, and my course tutor at the time hated me for it. He was like, I don't see the point in this. I hate it. It looks ugly. He was picturing that catwalk at the end of the year. So he was like super keen for me to have something beautiful to show. And I wanted to demonstrate, and it's not new. Susan Lee, that you might know of, has done a project called BioCouture like 15 years ago, I think. And she did an entire collection made of kombucha, and they were wearable garments that look like, bombers jackets and things. What I tried to do is take that inspiration and put it on a catwalk. And it was funny because I did it so well that nobody noticed this dress was entirely biofabricated. So they thought it was just another fabric going along the runway. And it was good and bad. I was like, check, my work is done here because I've made people accept something really crazy. But also, I realized that I should have communicated about what it was more specifically. So in our current work, I'm adapting my experience in sustainable regenerative design into ready-to-wear, where you have lots of problems. For example, you have the consumer behavior to think of. So how people wash their clothing, how they take care of it. Are they going to take care of something if it's quite luxury, if it's wool, things like that. So I don't think you can design without the customer in mind, as a short answer. It's really important to think about how people manipulate products.
Yeah, and what the consumer habits are going to end up being. It's stuff like, for example, take-back schemes and things, or recycling schemes. It's very good on the outset, but a lot of consumers might not necessarily do that because it's too much effort, or just because it's, not worth their time. But as a designer, you might be like, oh, this is a brilliant solution for it. But when you put it in the hands of the customer, does that actually follow through? It's like designing paths, and then you see that people have done a track way off of the path. It's just like, because you didn't design it to the customer, you designed it to how you wanted it, and the customer just went straight around what you wanted. So it's definitely like being realistic with who you're actually designing for, but trying to like still champion that sustainability and the natural aspect of it.
I was going to say you walk kind of a tight line in encouraging a different kind of behavior, but at the same time, you have to be grounded in the realities of how people operate and how people are going to use whatever you design. So that's really interesting to think of. Part of regenerative design is really understanding consumer use and kind of building that into what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And obviously, a dress made out of kombucha, I know, is a super vivid idea and an amazing visual. Is the future of fabric going to move in that direction, though? I know you talked about kind of using bacteria and microorganisms. I didn't know if that was like in the processing or, in this case, literally in the material. But do you see fabric eventually moving that direction? I've heard things like that, self-regenerating fabrics. What do you think, Aurelie?
Very interesting. So I think that's also one of the reasons why we started doing mycelium leather. Obviously, we knew there are some people in the United States that you have interviewed before that do it already on a actually big scale, and that they already want to take this to market. So it's super interesting. Personally, I would say that there's two things. As in every novelty, there's like the good aspects, the bad aspects, and probably that the pitfalls would be to think that everything novel is better. It's not true. And you just said it before. It's not because it's new that it's going to solve an issue. So I think with biomaterials and fabrics, we have this kind of really kind of almost like bio-revolution happening, where I don't know if you're aware, but they already make bacterial pigments that can be applied to clothing in the UK. It's a brand called Colorifics, and they've been developing that for 10 years. There's other companies doing that, and they work with Pangaea, and they already sell that. So that's kind of almost already happening. I think color is a very interesting sector for innovation on that. So algae, bacteria, even mushrooms. And I'd say for fabrics, it's more complicated because obviously the characteristics and the performance has to be there. So you can't just like do kombucha and think, oh, it's going to be a, luxury handbag, because it's not really. You need to engineer that. And that's the problem of maybe working with biology. Using natural processes without modifying the organism is very long, and we know it because that's how we're trying to do it. We're trying to develop a completely plastic-free, vegan,
non-GM,
biodegradable material, and it takes time because we're not cutting corners. So I think there's that other problem, is cutting corners to get to market as soon as possible is probably going to create other problems. But
and also solve the ground as well for the material when it does come out.
Yeah, definitely. Because in the 60s we had that problem where we had all this kind of super cool innovation like nylon and spandex and things like that, and everyone thought, wow, this is revolutionary. But are we risking to do the same thing again with biofabrication? It's another question.
Let's use it everywhere. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really good to point out, that cautionary approach to this new biomaterials field. And I know, as much as we said before, you're making a transition. It's not going to be perfect. But when we cut pretty significant corners, like, hey, a big part of our matrix or the thing that holds this together is going to be plastic, or, we've totally had to go in with CRISPR and modify this organism to do what we want. Those are pretty big corners we're cutting. So again, in transition, it's not going to be perfect, but how much are we willing to sacrifice? And so I guess, Ashley, then for your mycelium practice of Osmose Studios, we heard about mycelium leather. Again, that is the sexy thing. I think it's going to be huge. But where is your guys' practice evolving with mycelium? What kind of products are you trying to design and work with?
So we've been doing a lot of working with clients really closely in terms of what their desires are. So I guess one really good example of that is we worked on an interior design project for the Ledbury, which is a Michelin star restaurant in London. And the chef, Brett Graham, is the absolute sweetest but maddest of chefs in terms of his crazy ideas. And he really saw the beauty of the natural side of food, and how could we actually bring the food aspect into product, into material, into the atmosphere itself. So we worked with him to create these mycelium panels, also light shades and bowls to serve the tasting menus and things. And that was really working with kind of how he wanted the atmosphere and stuff. But quite a funny thing to say is we try to make it as pristine and clean as possible, because clients, usually that's what they always go for. They want as uniform, crisp edge as possible. And when we finally delivered the panels, Brett was like, it looks, a little bit too clean. It's like flipped it over to the not so nice side. By most of the clients' opinions, that would have been. And he was like, perfect. That's lovely. I love it. And I was just like biting myself. Like, I just tried to make it as clean as possible. But actually, it was really refreshing to be in a situation where actually he wanted wild, he wanted crazy. And yeah, it was a really cool project. They also have a mushroom fridge where they actually have the oysters and shiitake and stuff fruiting. And for vegetarians and vegans, they could go through that experience of being able to go and choose what mushrooms they wanted. And then the chefs would go and cook it up for their tasting menu. Yeah. So yeah, bringing that kind of food and material aspect in, and how they can kind of be a bit more symbiotic and tell a story, whilst also being completely biodegradable. You could eat it all if you wanted to. Wouldn't taste nice, probably cause you some problems later on down the line, but you could, munch on it as much as you want and it wouldn't ever poison you. And that's the same aspect for nature. Like, it would actually improve the soil condition. Once that interior wants to get refurbished again, all of that material is going to get composted down and it's going to improve the soil rather than be a problem. And I think a lot of interiors, they don't necessarily follow that kind of responsibility aspect. They think once it's built, once it's set in place, don't need to worry about it. But actually, as a designer, you should really consider the end of life, even if it is something like an interior project. I think one of the most wasteful aspects of industry of using building materials is stuff like set design, or building these pop-up stores that only last a week and then they're broken down and just literally sent to landfill. So swapping for a material that isn't actually going to leave any trace, it will just compost away. I think it's quite a beautiful way, but it's certainly not a new way of working. Things with the Amazon, where they're actually starting to find parts of the civilization, and the reason why they struggled to find it so much was they built it out of sticks, moss and wood, and it all just composted away and there was no trace of it. So that, I feel like we should still have that same kind of direction. We should have it where if we stop living, we don't have these huge towers still left over. Actually, everything kind of composts down and it returns to what it was before. So yeah.
That's so funny. At the end of our last interview, I remember asking you, like, what impact do you want to make? And you were like, I don't want to make any impact. I want it to compost away. So that kind of falls right in line. And with novel fields, with this biomaterials work, obviously a lot of innovation is guided by the market. That's something Phil Ross, who obviously you guys know about at MycoWorks, made abundantly clear to me is, look, I had all these crazy ideas, but in the end, I had to be guided by the market wanted to kind of make this engine of innovation and exploration go. So as much as I've been asking about, these consumer products I'm seeing on the site, because me and my wife want them, for you guys with the business, what areas, and maybe it's the kind of interiors and consultation you've been talking about, but what areas have allowed most of that growth economically to allow you to explore? How is the company evolving in this space? Is it kind of the retail product route, consultation, a little bit of everything, just a little bit behind the scenes of some of that kind of myco entrepreneurship side?
I think it's ever changing. I think it's almost like bubbles on the top of a water. It's just kind of growing and swelling depending on where the attention span is. We've done a lot of education, and that's been a really core passion to our business. So teaching people how to use micromaterials, and that it's not something that you need a lab to start doing. You simply just, as I started in my mum's bathroom, just, Bunsen burner going and a little scalpel blade that, you can start it for 50 quid and get into it. But yeah, we have kind of fluctuated and like I say, done a lot of interior design projects. We're wanting to move towards doing more design pieces, especially already with her fashion, to create it more, a more accessible kind of fashion direction, where it's something that can be picked up by people, where it's very accessible.
Yeah, I think we're not. A lot of people go, the venture routes where they have a single product, they want to just upscale and just we tried that with our leather. Still something we want to do, But as you know, you have to dedicate, like you've talked to Phil Ross, it's a long process. You have to dedicate an amount of time. And I think as designers, we still almost find it rewarding to have people use our products and to think about the supply chain. Because to give you an example, if we did manage to get this leather to market, it doesn't mean that people who buy it from us will use it in a sustainable way, because the infrastructure at the moment for recycling or end of life is just really poor. So these people would just, mash up a lot of different materials together, make a bag. It has lots of different components that can't be taken apart. So you've designed something really good in a sense, but the utilization of it is, not. So what's your impact in the end? You can't control these things. And I feel like we realized by designing our own products, making them, we have a full control on what's going on, where it comes from, what we source, and where it ends up as well. Because Ashley just talked about doing interiors. Well, it's important to think of mycelium material in the actual context, like where you're going to put it, what it does, and does the story kind of make sense? So we're actually quite picky with the clients we work with. If they ask us to do something that doesn't really align with our values, we might be like, well, would you consider doing something differently? Would you consider kind of compromising and meeting us halfway? Otherwise, we're not so interested, because as Ashley said, I think what's interesting is to tell the story to as many people as possible to get them accustomed to this material.
Yeah, and I guess that is the next question is how expansive is this landscape and what has that response been from people that reach out to you? I mean, are you guys fielding requests from loads of different industries? I guess just that overview of this landscape and the clients you're seeing interested in this and who wants to work with either mycelium materials or just more regenerative design processes. What are you guys seeing out there?
There's a lot. Honestly, there's so many opportunities so far. We do consulting. We also consult, Ashley does, with biofabrication companies that want to set up their manufacturer. So there's the large scale and there's the micro scale of independent interior designers that want to almost have our expertise on the subject. So I guess we have the product and design side of things. That's our passion. That's our life. That's what we want to put our kind of effort into. But on the other side, there's the almost environmental responsibility, which comes through education. Lots of people requesting, for example, artists who don't really know how to use these things and would like to incorporate it into their practice. So we don't really close the door to anyone just because of what they do. We're kind of super flexible. And if we can support the project, we will do it. And I guess that's kind of how you keep agile and you keep things interesting. Otherwise, if you select one industry, you say we're going to do, I don't know, hospitality for the rest of our lives. That's kind of it, you're closing the door to everything else. So,
and I think as artists as well, we really thrive on that wide variety of projects that we have coming in, because it really requires us to change hats a lot. And as Aurelie was saying, it keeps us agile, but I think it keeps things interesting as well. We're not doing the same things day in, day out. For example, we could do lots of mycelium packaging, but we really don't want to be doing 100,000 pieces of the same thing over and over again. It might have a big impact, but it's not really what we're best suited at. We're best suited at exploring just how much innovation there is and how much kind of scope for artistic merit or for product merit, and just kind of seeing, we really don't know. We're exploring in the dark as an industry. Like, we haven't really explored that much. So there's just so much scope for new things to be found from, how can you do the strangest of things? So, yeah.
Well, and as a tangent of thought here, that kind of style of being flexible, of really growing kind of organically, like you said, kind of these bubbles forming, or think of them as like hyphal threads reaching out. What's given us something here? Where should we reach here? Let's send out a little radical hyphae in another direction, see if we tap into something. There's part of that style of growing a business that kind of keys into a lot of these concepts of regenerative, biomimicry. As much as I think the VC route has its place to like go up like a rocket ship and explode and get to this massive scale, only time will tell, but who knows? We may look back on that and think, man, sometimes that can be very extractive and have negative externalities of kind of blowing up to scale and doing all these things and cutting all these corners, and then we abandon it, and then the fallout from that gets handled by someone else. So yeah, again, this is a tangent of thought that I'm just having and hearing you guys talk about it.
Yeah, you can definitely like end up kind of overlooking a lot of things if you build too quick. I think we're almost, to do the mushroom analogy, we're almost like a fairy ring. We've started from one point and we're growing out in all directions, but at a slow pace. We're not necessarily trying to jump ahead. But if we come across a freshly down tree, then we're really going to be able to grow quickly. But we will have had that forethought that we needed to think about what we need to be considering and how we can grow, how we can build. Because it's not a quick thing. It takes time to do these things.
And I was going to say from your question as well is that every business has an impact, and the size of your business also has an impact, and you're actually trying to resolve the potential consequences of that impact even before you start trading. That's what you have to do. You have to think, okay, if we set up a huge manufacturer, where does the waste go? How do we recycle the water? Where do we get our energy from? So there's a lot of decisions that you have to be okay with making in a way, and they're super impactful because it's like the scale is huge. So I think what we're trying to do is almost like not downgrade the scale, but try to work at a scale that we feel comfortable with, where we feel that the control is still there and we don't have to make decisions that we're just not going to be happy with.
Yeah. And again, I think it comes from this aspect of, in nature, we don't have these one single huge bodies that are, conglomerated together. We have lots of little nodes of different sizes growing together. And we want to help foster that, but also be a node in that network. I think to have more localized manufacturing, we're based up in North Nottinghamshire, so we try and get all of our resources from like a 50-kilometer radius. Our mushrooms are isolated from a couple of kilometers away in a forest, and all of our kind of raw resources are harvested nearby. So if we can have lots of little ones like that all over the UK, all over the world, that's a lot more sustainable than having one huge warehouse or factory that does it all, but is extracting from maybe halfway across the world. And certainly the scale is just, is an exponential impact. It's not necessarily like it scales slowly. The bigger you get, it gets out of control. And if you don't think about those ahead of time, you're firefighting whilst you've already got the structure built. And it's so hard to change a system when you've already built it. Right. Think about it before, and that little bit of consideration goes a lot further when you actually push it out.
And I think there are so many advantages to those nodes being kind of whole and complete unto themselves, independent units. Because I have heard some, attractive business models where people are kind of scaling up and then they'll set up those localized nodes under their franchise. And again, I'm no economist and I'm not judging the way anyone does business because I'm not qualified. But I will say that I see so many advantages to a more decentralized network and knowledge share where you get that real diversity of voices in business, ideas in business. You diffuse the economic benefit of these concepts to those local communities, not kind of funneling back to the centralized monolith of, the big HQ that owns it all. So yeah, I think there's so much in there that really is kind of how biomimicry maybe can guide economics if folks kind of choose this path, choose the path you guys are doing, which is following the intuition, following where your feelers are taking you, and not necessarily purely focusing on a business plan, scaling right away. It sounds like that's kind of a choice that you guys are making, is to let's explore how we can get these things out there now in a sustainable way, in kind of this organic growth way, versus our whole business is us kind of writing plans and fundraising.
Yeah.
100%. And I think the reason why anyone does a business is because they think they can do something better than what already exists. So that's an interesting concept, and I think it's needed. But also in the mycelium industry, or biomaterials, there's the question of, do we actually need this product? Is this product already not just maybe to the best that it can be already? So there's like, what's your angle on it? So I think it's like asking yourself, am I better consulting for other companies and helping them with my knowledge in a kind of collaborative way? Or do we do our own thing and decide we can do it better? So there's kind of like walking that line of understanding where we can be most helpful in the scene, rather than saying, oh, we'll do our little thing in our corner and we're just not going to tell anyone about it, which is sadly a lot of the mentality. Obviously, you have to stay competitive in business. That's fair. So yeah, it's almost like, as you said, decentralizing is super important. Like, we've realized that regenerative design, in the true sense of regenerative, for example, fostering ecosystems through your products, you can't do it in a city. You have to be in the countryside, because you have to understand the clear impact that you have on a certain ecosystem. So that's why we also left London. There's lots of decisions that you make to follow through with your values for a business, for example. So yeah.
Well, and you guys are pushing novel design ideas, but I also love that we're trying new ways of doing business. And again, I'll say that caveat. This is not to disparage anyone's projects they're working on, how they're navigating our different systems of economics, but I really resonate with kind of the choices you guys are making and the way that you're consciously thinking about it. And I am super curious in this field of innovation. I know one of the things that really inspired me in our last conversation, Ashley, was some of your bioprospecting. So how strong is that? I mean, how strong is the exploration of new materials for you guys? If that's bioprospecting, or maybe that's something else that you guys kind of find ways to find novel biomaterials. But talk about that a little bit. How are you guys branching out and finding new materials?
Yeah, so I guess before, when we first had our conversation, I think I was doing it very blindly. I think I was going down the trial and error aspect as how I learned how to work with fungi. I was doing that same practice on the material side of things, and really just kind of saying why not try it. Nowadays, it's been a lot more of a balancing act, especially working with clients, because as much time as I have, I would love to be working on the material side of things. But like I say, it's always a seesaw in terms of time management. But materials wise, we're doing a lot of testing in terms of like the resources we can feed the fungi. And I think that's the main kind of scope of potential positive impact. It's like fungi are so adaptable at digesting all sorts of things. I mean, I spoke before, we have like fungi in Chernobyl on the reactor walls that's digesting the radiation. So it's like, that is to show an extent of how adaptive they can be at just the oddest of food sources. So we're really trying to take that aspect and bring it back into business of like working with a client. What are their wastes? Can we use any of those wastes as a feedstock for the mycelium to then return it to their business? A lot of customers have or clients have cardboard waste as just cardboard paper. Everyone has it. So how could you turn that into a new material after it's served its purpose? So yeah, I've been doing a lot of exploration in that, and how we can kind of reintegrate things which potentially will be low value or even a problem resource, and just kind of bringing it back into a design sense, and how that can kind of translate into a product. So yeah, doing a lot of strange, odd things of stuff like coal dust and things like that. How can we start feeding that to fungi and creating something that has a really good positive final outcome, and kind of it goes back to that regenerative design aspect of things.
And I think there's an aspect of biodiversity here as well, because as you know, a lot of companies, maybe they would target a single organism because it's very technical to work with, and you have to just like do a lot to it to get to where you want to be. But in my kind of values of trying to almost keep ecosystems together, you have to also think, is my impact working with one organism actually what I want to do? Because if you scale up, it's like a monocrop, if I can make an analogy with agriculture. So you're monocropping in your lab. And so is it interesting maybe that smaller studios like ourselves start having a library of organisms, and that we're not just singling one out and say this is the best and we don't care about the others, because actually everything in nature has a place and has a purpose. So that's what's interesting, is to try and keep fostering a biodiversity of both practices and organisms.
Well, wouldn't we love to hear every business kind of have that ethos embedded somewhere? And you hinted at it before that you're not taking shortcuts in working with mycelium as a biomaterial. So I guess if you can give us a little bit of that overview, how are you maybe selecting for traits? How are you doing things the long way to nurture and work with some of these organisms to kind of achieve some of the outcomes you're looking for?
So I guess it goes back to kind of the difference between, for example, genetic modification versus directed evolution. So directed evolution, for anyone who doesn't know, is basically a forceful way of training an organism to change or adapt in either a stressed environment or a preferable environment. So that takes time. It's a lot of reiteration of the organism, of whatever you're doing. And it does, like say, take a lot longer to achieve versus GM, where it's very targeted and you get what you want pretty quickly. But the problem being is how those organisms are then a part of nature. Have we basically isolated it away from nature by modifying it? And given that our materials, we want them to be compostable, what's the risk in that? If there is any bit of mycelium still living on it that is genetically modified, how is that going to hybridize with nature? We know fungi are very prolific in hybridizing, and the last thing we want to do is to mess with the genetics, the gene pool that we have around us, because that's what we're trying to preserve. We're not really trying to tamper with that. So those things take a lot longer. And certainly on the business side of things, we are wanting to make sure that we maintain control of the ethos, because when you start taking on investors, it really starts to really malform intentions, because you have a lot of pressure coming from different sources that maybe you're not able to say no to.
Yeah, I mean, you have to make compromises. And I think there's, as you said, there's, those ways, they're perfectly valid because you need the money to scale and get your solution to market. And that's, that's your mission. That's what you want to do. And then there's the almost like, we live on an island here in the UK. So it's like thinking, wow, we have very limited spaces and our ecosystems are actually disappearing like year after year. And biodiversity is dying as well. We've lost so much, like half of the UK's biodiversity is already gone. So like, how can we help in that way? And I think that's where businesses in fashion or design need to go there in that space. It's beyond trying to do the right thing. I think now it's how does your business have an impact after the product is used on the environment or throughout its life or its change? Like, what do you give back to? Like, do you support charities or do you support like rewilding? These are super important concepts. And I think a lot of companies are doing it now and super well. So.
Well, one of the other things you're highlighting too is the challenge of consistency versus exploring biodiversity and having these other considerations, because when you're working with this as a material, you want it to be eminently consistent. And even if you're working with directed evolution, things like trying a new food source, moving a culture onto a new food source. It was a mushroom farmer here at Monterey Mushrooms in California. Amir, when he took me to his farm, he explained that even when we move them on between bags of grain, I think it's 100 different gene pairs potentially switch. So there's mutations in just moving to food sources. There's so much variability in there. So even, we're talking directed evolution is a little bit of slower process, but there's so much change possible that when you're trying to find a consistent product that you can use for something, there's an inherent challenge in there, especially paired with an ethos of like, we like diversity and we're trying to consider the kind of full lifetime impact of this. That's really a big challenge you guys are taking on. But like you said, really a challenge that it would be great to see businesses take on in the future, because on a long enough time scale, really caring about these themes does play into your business's viability, because maybe, it's our viability here.
Yeah. It might not translate in a 2 to 5 year period in terms of like growing a business. It's definitely not going to be the most profitable, but in terms of scaling without an impact, without leaving a trace, I think that is something that people should idealize. It should be something you aim for. But
I think it's all about making biomaterials credible for consumers, really, because the quicker we can do that, the quicker the transition that you mentioned is going to happen, and just phasing out fossil fuel-based materials and trying to, for that to happen, it needs to meet so many criteria of, production. Consistency is a big problem, as you mentioned as well, because people in their minds, they're so used to having everything identical. You go into a shop and you know that every product that you're going to buy is the same quality across, it's the same look. So are we challenging that? I think we should as well, because it's about going back to a form of craft, essentially. And, I don't think the distinction for biomaterials between craft and mass production is going to be the same as we know it today. I think it's going to go back to something a bit more kind of in between, because it's all natural, and it's formed by nature. So yeah,
it's definitely a lot more of like following nature and watching it, like we were saying before, than it is trying to like force it down a rabbit hole. It does have its pitfalls in terms of when you're giving the artistic license, let's say, to fungi, things don't always turn out what your intentions are. For me, I enjoy that beauty of it. For customers, sometimes it can be quite a jarring thing, or something that you have to really educate a little bit to get their understanding of it. But I think it's a beautiful thing, but it can be a pain in the ass when it's just really not going the way you want it to. Like with the mutations and things, you really can't have much control over it. It is just as likely to mutate and become sterile than it is to adapt to a new food source. So how do we kind of like increase those odds and work with the pros and cons of the organism, rather than just like, it's not working how I want it to, so I'm going to change it so it does. So yeah.
I think erring on the side of maintaining diversity and following nature is always the right side to be on. And, if we can get the chef you're working with to disseminate some of that attitude of like, hey, turn it over, show me the rough side, show me the natty, the natural born side of this thing, that would be fantastic to see that disseminate into the retail market. And, thank God it can't come soon enough. I'm so sick of seeing the same mass produced junk everywhere. So hopefully this, as a byproduct, that kind of attitude disseminates, and as we're speaking during this interview, you guys are playing off each other so well. You're delivering fantastic answers. And I have to know, because my wife is such a big part of kind of everything I do, what's it like to be partners and be working in business together? It's the natural question, because everyone has assumptions about how you can work as a business and everything else. But what has that been like, that growth and evolution?
Yeah. So, I guess a caveat to that, we got married literally 5 days ago, 6 days ago. So we've definitely added another layer to the partnership. Yeah. It doesn't feel like it compares to the business partnership. I feel like that's a lot more complicated than getting married. But yeah, it's quite funny. I feel like a lot of people ask us that and are horrified by trying to relate to that. And be like, I could never work with my other half.
It's
but I think
probably the best and the worst thing at the same time. I guess that's how you must be. It's like, because you get the best because you're always connected on the same page, you know where you're going together, but also the worst because you have to learn about strengths and weaknesses and accept that eventually. So I will never be able to change Ashley into being a specific type of person.
We can use directed evolution, but
it also comes into how well do you understand each other. If he wants to be crazy design all the time and not focus about stuff like admin and finances, that's fine. Actually, he does the finances and then the crazy design on at the same time. But that's, I think, it's acceptance. I think it's being super, let's say, just understanding.
You just got to be in tune with each other.
And
it takes a lot of maintenance, but I think we really enjoy it. I wouldn't have it any other way, for sure. It's been a crazy journey since we started, and what we've been through and the experiences we've had. I think I wake up every morning like, hell yeah, this is my job. Like, how is this a thing?
I think we also quite often, because we're in our little bubble, we often think, oh wow, where are we going? We don't really know where we're going. And then the other goes like, oh my God, can you not believe what we've done this month? It's amazing. And then we're just like questioning each other all the time. So we're almost trying to motivate each other to see what we're doing, because essentially designers, we question ourselves 24/7.
Yeah.
So
we're a bunch of insecure.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to have that person that like has your back no matter what.
Yeah. Absolutely. One of the biggest things in business is someone to bounce ideas off of. And that's what I found so much. My business isn't Mushroom Hour. I actually do accounting as a day job, but having my wife kind of intimately involved in all this stuff, there's challenges, but there's also a deepening that happens both at the business level, at the personal relationship level. So if you can kind of find that right way to navigate, and some of that is finding your lane, like, hey, you're going to be crazy design guy. I'm just going to deal with that. We're going to let you thrive there, and we're going to find ways to handle this other stuff. Maybe that's part of the equation. But I just love hearing that. And there's part of asking that question with the other person present. I wonder, would we get different answers? No, I'm totally kidding. I'm totally kidding.
Yeah, we'll split now. We'll go into both our own ways and have our own opinion.
That's the bonus on the podcast.
It's definitely an amazing thing. And I owe a lot to Aurelie. Definitely this business wouldn't have grown how it was if it wasn't with her alongside me.
I had a feeling we had I had a feeling we had someone kind of powering there, that Aurelie was kind of a missing part of that equation for letting you grow kind of more in the biomaterial space. Well, we talked a lot about the products and about your guys' work. Obviously, I'm in the States, but where can people, get your products? Where can people maybe book you for consultations? What's the best way to reach out and kind of get everything that Osmose Studios has to offer?
I would say just drop us a line. I mean, it's like nowadays anywhere you can drop us a line works. Just Instagram, Osmose Studio or Osmose_lab. And obviously our website, just send an inquiry. We try to work internationally as much as we can. We only sell our products in the UK. That's a deliberate choice at the moment for Brexit, but also for environmental reasons. So it's kind of a very kind of localized business model. But for consultation or anything else, like, we love having people asking us things. We try to deliver classes when we can, and it's just after the pandemic and Brexit, it's been like really difficult, and we've done our first workshop this year, like recently, and it's just amazing to get back into getting people to touch mycelium for the first time. It's just you can't get anything better than that. You see their faces. So what?
You think, wow, they've been inoculated. Success. You see the change happening in their brain. Well, and we've talked about a lot of far out ideas, but I guess in the wish space, as Osmose grows, what's kind of a far out application of mycelium, or maybe another biomaterial? Maybe it is something with kombucha, but what's a far out application of biomaterials that you would like to be able to explore with the business in the future?
I think we had a crazy idea of mixing pigmented bacteria with mushrooms and try to see if they would work together.
That's amazing.
Because that would be, so basically, as you know, the fashion industry has so many problems, and if we're talking materials, there's color. Those two things need to work together. So could you have material and color that's biofabricated?
Basically all living aspects of the design is just given to an organism.
Yeah.
I think just getting people's attention with more products and just having it as a more commonplace thing in a house, I think would be my wish. For me, it's very biased. I would love to have my whole house made out of mushrooms, but it really makes me feel like I'm doing the right thing when people start seeing that for themselves and they want to actually start including and decorating what they have around them with actual things that tell a story and have a positive impact rather than a negative one.
Well, and that idea about blending the dye bacteria with fungi, I mean, they're a lichen that might already be a reference organism for that. So you may not be far off. That could be an amazing symbiosis. I love that kind of thing. And of course, a house made out of mycelium, could it self-replicate? Could you feed your house? Everyone loves that idea.
Yep, for sure.
Well, then I'll wrap things up with a few questions I like to ask all of my guests. And there are no wrong answers. And the first question, people often try to give me their favorite. It doesn't have to be a favorite, but a mushroom or fungus that you love and why. It can be one you love to eat, one you love to work with, but just a mushroom or fungus you love and why. And Aurelie, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I know. Okay. I want to know this answer.
I've had a vague obsession with chanterelles lately. So just because of the color and also the shape of it, it's just beautiful. And in France, there's actually a mushroom that everyone likes to cook with. And has a beautiful French chanterelle name.
And for myself, oh God, that's really hard. I think it's still got to be honey fungus, Armillaria malea, just in terms of how crazy it looks when you put it onto an agar plate. It's almost, it feels a lot more alive and a lot more like an animal than it does with other mycelium when you're growing it. So yeah, that's definitely my favorite still. And it is, of course, the largest organism on the planet. So, it holds that record.
Well, and the last time you shared that, you told me that story of Scandinavian soldiers taking armillaria hyphal threads or mycelium threads and using it to like sew and using it. So I'm still waiting for someone to come out with armillaria threads after you threw that at me last time.
Yeah, maybe I'll try and pressure Aurelie that way.
I like cute stuff. You like the dark stuff.
Yeah, well, and I love that. Like any idea we start throwing out, you guys are like, yeah, we can explore that. Let's do that one. I love that. And then,
No,
a big broad, there you go. And then a big broad kind of open-ended question. But what has this relationship that each of you have developed with fungal organisms given to you? I mean, you're already very conscientious, kind of broad thinking people, it seems like to me, but how has this relationship you've developed with fungal organisms changed you, lessons it's taught, all that kind of thing?
I think I have to give credit where credit's due, but I'm a city girl. I lived in Paris most of my life, then London. So I think discovering more about mushrooms for me was almost like this entire uncovered world of things you can do with it. Even pigments, materials, obviously what it does in nature, which is super important, and that I think we have overlooked for so long as well. And it's really cool to see almost collective consciousness getting on board with the mushroom train as well. So for me, it's brought me probably better connection with nature that I've always craved, but didn't really like where to get it from because it's accessible. It's not a very complex concept that you have to study to understand to a certain point. And I was not allowed to continue biology, so perfect for me.
Yeah, and I think for myself, among having a lot of these little biomimicry aspects of it in terms of how you should run a business and how you could connect and network and have these localized nodes rather than bigger masses, I think I'm very grateful for the fact that it's enabled me to be able to do what I'm doing and to kind of not necessarily pull away from the rat race per se, but to be able to like set our own path and not really have to do it because a boss tells us it has to be done this specific way. So I think just being able to, forge our own path, not really have to take note of what the standards are, let's say, I think is the most amazing thing for me about having fungi on this planet. I'm so lucky to be able to work with it as a material.
Well, speaking of collective consciousness, I wonder if you guys were like in my head, because those are two of the biggest things that working with fungi gives to me is that connection to nature and is reshaping human narratives. I think we're going to see more and more that really our understanding of these organisms, really as we dive into microbiology more and more and see how other organisms give us new templates of understanding behavior and ways to symbiose and either work together. And beautiful, beautiful, insightful answers. I'm switching up my last question because I think we talked so much aspirational and change we want to see in the world just embedded in what you guys do. So maybe I'll keep it a little more light and fun and just ask, some books, or maybe it's other media. I feel like you guys might be book readers, but some books or other media that you're enjoying right now that are kind of having an impact on you.
Ooh. For a strange one, I've kind of been going back into Francis Crick's work of DNA, but not necessarily how he discovered it, more the scientific structure of how he was thinking and how he was blending inspiration outside of him into the work that he was doing. So and it kind of goes into this kind of what do we define as self and who are we? So that's definitely been a rabbit hole that I've been jumping down lately. But
yeah, for me, I think I'm really interested in the speculative aspect of biomaterials. So like reading more theory about it, because obviously we work in the now and in the kind of credible and tangible. But obviously I went to the Royal College of Art to do my master's, and there's really great thinkers coming out of it. And one of them is Daisy Ginsburg. And she wrote a book called Synthetic Aesthetic, and she's curated lots of different types of writings. But her work herself, she works as a biohacker and biothinker. So that's interesting to see outside of a business. What is the kind of like the academic or kind of, thinking collective doing on those things, because they are probably the people that keep our bioethics in check. So that's interesting.
Practical side and aesthetic side.
Well, but I was going to say, it's always important to be looking just outside the scope of kind of business or what's, practical economically and see what all the frontiers are. So I love that. And thank you for putting Daisy Ginsburg on my radar and for changing a little bit of what I thought about Francis Crick. I mean, we're questioning self, we're questioning, I had one image and I think you just expanded on that. Well, guys, thank you both so much for showing up to this interview with kind of your full attention, amazing, insightful answers, and kind of lifting the curtain a little bit for us on what the biomaterials field is like in the day-to-day and what it's like to do this for a living. And you guys took all my kind of open-ended answer and just gave us some beautiful answers and insights. So thank you so much for joining us on the Mushroom Hour.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
And hopefully see you in another 2 years.